3 deaths in 3 years. 3 men incarcerated at the Isle of Man prison. 3 lives lost, all in similar circumstances. 1 pledge: lessons will be learnt. My name is Tessa Hawley. I'm one of the news editors here at Manx Radio, and this episode of Island Life will take you behind the scenes of somewhere you probably never want to end up: the Isle of Man prison. Before we start, I must warn you that this programme will contain information you may find distressing, as well as references to suicide. In July this year, Manx Radio was in court for the inquest into the death of serving prisoner Christopher Corkill. The 46-year-old was found dead in his cell on the 24th of February 2023. Mr. Corkill's death followed that of fellow prisoners Craig Anderson in 2022 and Carn Douglas in 2020. All of their inquests were held in front of a jury. At Mr. Corkill's, jurors recorded a verdict of suicide. The question on your mind, perhaps, is how 3 people, all with noted vulnerabilities, could end up dying alone in their cells in a place which ultimately is responsible for keeping people safe. In order to look at what went wrong, and in fairness to what's been improved since, let's first go back to 2020 and the death of Carn Douglas. The 29-year-old died in his cell on the 31st of March that year, a day after being taken into custody. The jury at his inquest, held in 2022, found neglect had contributed to his death because he'd not been given adequate protection from self-harm, and well-documented risks were not acted on. The jury concluded that Mr. Douglas had died by suicide whilst the balance of his mind was affected. Shortly after those court proceedings concluded, the Department of Home Affairs released a statement saying,
"Deaths in custody are rare in the Isle of Man, and the department takes its responsibilities under the Custody Act seriously. Immediately after Carn's death, work began to make improvements that would reduce the possibility of another family having to endure this loss. The coroner has been informed of this work and the ongoing efforts to ensure that those who are in custody at the Isle of Man prison continue to be kept safe, particularly those who are most vulnerable."
But just over 6 months after that statement was made, on the 25th of November 2022, Craig Anderson was found dead in his cell. The 28-year-old's inquest in April this year concluded that he too had died by suicide whilst the balance of his mind was disturbed. Delivering a narrative verdict in this case, jurors noted that whilst there was no neglect, there had been a missed opportunity to render care that could have made a difference to the outcome. And just 3 months later, on the 24th of February 2023, Christopher Corkill became the 3rd inmate to take his own life. On a small island like the Isle of Man, with a small prison population, it was perhaps only natural that 3 deaths in custody in 3 years raised concerns. The deaths of Mr. Anderson and Mr. Corkill sparked independent investigations by the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman, which were instigated by the Department of Home Affairs. Both were started in April 2023, and the PPO reports, which are dated January 2024, were released publicly in May and July this year. Mr. Douglas's death was not reported on, as his inquest had already concluded by this time. The PPO found that at the time of Mr. Anderson and Mr. Corkill's deaths, the prison had not made sufficient changes or responded to the learning from the death of Mr. Douglas in 2020. The PPO also found the management of prisoners at risk of self-harm or suicide was inadequate, and mental health provision was inadequate and unsafe, and not equivalent to what's available in the community. There were also unsafe practices noted in relation to the issuing of medication, as well as a lack of clinical governance and quality oversight dedicated to prison healthcare. Now, the PPO investigation followed a separate inspection from His Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons that was undertaken between February and March 2023. Again, at the request of the DHA, inspectors visited the Derby facility where they found many missed opportunities and poor systems of accountability. It was the first inspection since 2011, and 14 areas of concern were identified. Government was told 6 of these should be treated as priorities, which required immediate attention. The prison governor, Leroy Bonnick, spoke to Manx Radio following the release of that report.
The department has obviously commissioned that the Prison and Probation Ombudsman come across and look at our procedures and see what lessons can be learned from there. So that's ongoing. And at the end of that, I'm sure there may be some recommendations of how we can do things a lot better in terms of what we're currently doing.
You're listening to Death in Custody, an Island Life episode looking at what's being done to improve the island's prison system following the deaths of 3 people in 3 years. A reminder that this programme contains information you may find distressing and references to suicide. HMIP conducted a follow-up review between the 30th of April and the 2nd of May this year. This time, the inspectors found encouraging improvements with good or reasonable progress made against 9 of the highlighted concerns. Crucially, the body found that governance and oversight of many critically important areas of accountability had improved. There had, HMIP said, also been considerable effort by prison leaders to improve the care of those at risk of suicide or self-harm. And speaking after Mr. Corkill's inquest, Prison Governor Bonnick, who's also the head of the Prison and Probation Service, told me he was confident that things were now improving for the better.
I'm satisfied that whilst, we haven't had good in some areas, I'm satisfied that we're moving in the right direction in terms of making those improvements that are required for us to get to the standards. Every quarter, I sit in front of the Chief Officer, the Minister, and we scrutinise these key areas that were highlighted, along other areas of the prison that needs to be, we need to do our checks and balances, that defensible decisions have been made, and that basically we're not marking our own homework, to ensure that there is compliance.
They obviously looked at the issues of self-harm and suicide. Now, originally they said that the treatment of those at risk of self-harm or suicide was inadequate. The update has found that there's been considerable effort and good progress made by prison leaders to improve the care. Given the prison did have 3 deaths in 3 years, how important was it for you and your team to improve in this area?
Oh, very important. And, regardless, of what the outcome had, or whether HMIP had come to our shores, those are areas we'd have to improve. We also had the PPO report, the Prison and Probation Ombudsman that look at deaths in custody. So there were recommendations made as a result of that. So again, we go back to the quarterly meetings where we scrutinise in terms of that. It was, imperative that, we improve within those areas. Hence the introduction of the ACT document that they talk about in the report. And again, he emphasised, how quickly we had made those improvements in terms of safeguarding the people that we look after. And he emphasised on that in terms of certainly his visits to institutions across, the UK and elsewhere he goes. That has been a significant progress, and he commended the staff management and prisoners that have been involved in that.
What impact has 3 deaths in 3 years in custody had on the mental health of not only the prisoners but also the staff that work there on a daily basis? That must have had some impact.
It does have an impact, and some of those staff have probably been involved with probably a couple of those deaths in custody. So we try and put measures in place to support those staff. Our forensic psychologists team are now working with prisoners and some of those staff that have felt that it's had an effect impact on their mental well-being.
We are talking at a time that the 3 inquests into the deaths in custody have now concluded. This, I guess, has been a massive learning process for the prison. There's been a spotlight shone on some really difficult subjects, some really difficult things have been sort of brought to light. How does the prison move forward from this?
Well, we look at the recommendations that will come out as a result of that and obviously build on those. And, we talked earlier about the ACT document that, is a big part of how we do our daily work in addressing, prisoners that are going through crisis and self-harming, and that is a key component in terms of keeping people safe. One death is one death too much, as, and I think, I was questioned at length, on the stand with regard to that. And, unfortunately, in my 34 years, we've seen deaths each time in prison. But, we need to work with the systems we've got with those prisoners and continue to, safeguard, their well-being.
Are you confident that the prison is a safe place?
Oh, most definitely, yes. It is a safe place, yes.
When we talk about mental health, obviously that was a big focus of the reports and it's been a big focus of the inquests. They did say that they didn't think that the mental health provision in the prison was equivalent to what people would get in the community. What reassurance can you give people that that is an area that's had real focus and that actually things have improved in regards to mental health for the better?
As I said during the inquest, I believe they have more opportunities within the prison to access mental health. We have a GP that's on 5 days a week during the core day of the prison that they can see a GP. We have the other services come in. We have a mental health nurse that isn't actually, she's not full-time, but have access and can do a triage and signpost them to in terms of, what treatment is needed. But equally so as well, most of them are there for, we've got a captive audience and gives us the opportunity. What I would say that you mirror that about getting an appointment in the community, and I say differently.
One of the other things that was highlighted in the inquest was the prison's policy on informing the next of kin when somebody has died. We know that in the cases of Mr. Anderson and Mr. Corkill, they weren't notified of the deaths by the prison. They also weren't sent letters of condolence. Was that acceptable, and are any changes going to be made if this happens again in the future?
Look, we have contingency plans for most eventualities that happen in the prison, as we do when the unfortunate time comes for a death in custody. Now, our process is to inform the family and everything else, but what I can't go into here is the reasons why that didn't happen at the time. I made a public apology to the Corkill family at the time, and I believe the same when, the Anderson, but there were issues around that at the time with the constabulary on site, in time, and the advice I was given with the persons in charge of the case at the time at the prison. And it wasn't through we didn't care or through neglect, it was just circumstances at the time. I know that is not going to give the families any comfort because they felt that we neglected them.
And just finally, I just wanted to raise a point which you did raise when you were giving your evidence to the inquest, and I think effectively you said that it's almost impossible to remove risk from a prison. Now, people would maybe perceive that prisons by their very nature are locked down and, staff have oversight and control over everything, but it is impossible to remove all risk.
You can never eliminate risk 100%, and obviously, as I say, one is one too many, but, certainly my experience of 34 years, prisoners, I talked about always find a way. Unfortunately, what we have to do is recognise that these individuals are in distress and work through that with them. And certainly, the moving away from the folder 5 to the ACT document has given us, I would never be able to sit here and say, there's never going to be, and obviously we're an island, but, I'm in constant contact with some of my counterparts across, and, every so often you hear, we've had a death in custody, which is unfortunate, but it happens.
The phrase lessons will be learned is such a used phrase. It's probably maybe such an overused phrase, but in these cases, moving forward now, will lessons be learnt?
Whilst I'm at the helm, most definitely, and the staff, always strive to do better in terms of their, their daily job, and in terms of looking after prisoners, which I'm proud of the staff and the way they go about their work, and despite the trauma that it has caused some individuals, they come back the following day and do a great job.
The HMIP report also noted that the prison healthcare team had been placed in special measures in December 2023. Paul Moore is Manx Care's outgoing Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Nursing and Governance.
Special measures is a mechanism, an internal mechanism that we have inside Manx Care for providing a period of intensive support to a service that is experiencing some challenge. It was my call really to put the prison healthcare service into special measures in December last year after we were in receipt of the findings of both the Inspector of Prisons report and also the findings of the Prison and Probation Ombudsman. Both those reports were quite significant in that they revealed a lot of aspects of care that we needed to work on and develop. And the scale of that change and the capacity to deliver that change felt to me as though we needed to put some intensive support into the team to enable that change to take place as quickly as possible.
I guess the question would be, why had things been allowed to go so wrong?
I don't think I would say that they were allowed to go wrong. I think that it's a very challenging environment to operate in. Since I joined the team at Manx Care, we've been focused on improving the offender healthcare service, but against a backdrop of some difficulty, particularly difficulty in terms of culture, particularly difficulty in terms of recruitment, retention, and the stability of the workforce. And the leadership in particular meant that even though we were working on some of those problems, we weren't able to gain the level of traction that we needed in the time scale that we wanted. So I think it's fair to say we weren't allowing it to happen. We were trying to improve the situation, but circumstances were getting bigger than we were.
Do you think things have genuinely improved now?
In short, yes, but I don't think that's the end of the journey by any stretch of the imagination. So I think special measures have allowed us to get phase one of an offender healthcare improvement plan off the ground. And I think that represents the foundation for what has to come next. We're still going to have to do quite a bit of work on offender healthcare improvement to continue to modernise, to continue to build the workforce and the capability of that workforce, to focus in particular on something called the principle of equivalence, which is ensuring that from a healthcare perspective, offender or otherwise, you have the same level of access to healthcare as you might expect if you were not in custody. It's the beginning of something rather than the end of something.
You did mention before the word governance. Now, the HMIP, when they've done their sort of update to their big review from 2023, said that they thought that there had been reasonable progress made in this area. They said that their strategic and operational working relationships between the prison and Manx Care were now well embedded. What difference do you think that makes?
It's a very broad concept. To try and simplify it a little bit, I think it's essential for being able to make progress. Governance allows you to control things and it allows you to be assured that things are working as intended. And more importantly, it allows you to make corrective adjustments to things that need changing or improving. So without governance, it's very difficult to make any meaningful change. But it's not the only thing. Sitting alongside governance is people, and having empowered, enabled, happy people at work who are capable of working in that environment to a very high standard is equally essential. And also having the expertise and the frameworks, the standards, the professional codes equally play a very important part in how we run a service in there. So it's an important part, but not everything.
The reports themselves do highlight the morale of healthcare staff as being low. Staff were frustrated by a lack of response from senior managers when issues were raised, and it found that there wasn't enough resilience overall in the healthcare system. How do you address a problem like that? Because we know that there are issues with staffing across all sectors of society, it seems, at the moment. When it's in such an important area like the prison, when all eyes, to be fair, are on the prison after the events that have unfolded over the last few years, how do you tackle the morale of staff and how do you tackle recruitment and retention issues there?
With great difficulty, I think. It's complex. and far from straightforward. But the way that we've approached this at Manx Care is to, in a combination of ways. One of the ways is to listen carefully to what people have to say. And I think that I can't emphasise enough just how important that is. Most of the remedies or solutions that we need to find already exist in the minds of the people who work in the service. And as leaders, it's very important to just tap into that knowledge sometimes. The other way, I think, is what we've tried to achieve is to build capability of the people who work in the service. So skill them up, bring expertise on board, start to define and describe the standards that we expect and require of people, and openly discuss any difficulties in achieving them so that we can iron them out in advance. That's been a really important part. The next bit really is to educate and support. Because as much as I'd like to think it was as simple as listening to people and describing the frameworks they operate, the reality is it's very different. People experience the challenges of working in an environment like that. It's a very different healthcare space than anything else that you might experience. It takes a special kind of person to function and thrive in that environment. And so that listening, supporting, coaching is how we've been approaching it over the last year or so inside Manx Care. And to some extent with some success, because we have by and large stabilised the workforce. We've had to support it with some extra help, but we are on a recruitment drive at the moment and have the potential for bringing new recruits on board in the next few weeks, which I didn't think we would be able to do that again, given all the publicity, which I think is fantastic.
There had been criticism that the pharmacy services up there had a lack of oversight, unsafe prescribing practices and very little sort of management. How was it allowed to get to a stage where unlawful prescribing was happening? And what has Manx Care done in this area to improve that situation?
It happened without being escalated, in part because of the geographical location of the prison and how it works. It's a closed environment, so unless someone tells you something's not quite right, you may not know as a leadership team. And when the findings of the Ombudsman and the Inspector of Prisons revealed to us that we had some issues with prescribing practice, that's when we took immediate action. And I think you're right to say, as the Inspector and the Ombudsman have pointed out, we needed a bigger focus on medicines optimisation and medicine safety in the prison healthcare system. The largest share of our offender improvement plan has been medicines management.
Mental health was a consistent theme throughout the reports. At the time of the first report that came out, I think it said that the mental health service offered there was inadequate, unsafe and not equivalent to what was in the wider community. What has Manx Care done to tackle this area? Because I guess the question is, how does Manx Care balance the mental health needs of the prison population against the mental health needs of the general population? Firstly,
I'd say that we acknowledge that we did need to make some improvements on mental health, having reflected carefully on the findings of the Inspector of Prisons report and the Ombudsman. We do need to get slicker, more responsive referral pathways in place, and we need to streamline those referral pathways so that people they don't go down one path or another path and the rest of the organisation isn't clear where that person's up to. I think that is the same inside or outside of prison, to be fair. And it is something we're absolutely focused and determined to work on. This isn't a question around unlimited resources, though, for me. This is a question around being able to meet health need. And in many respects, the mental health needs of people in custody, it doesn't quite mirror exactly the needs of the population as a whole. In fact, there's a disproportionate higher need for mental health input for people in custody, as you might expect. And so I think it's right and proper to be keeping under constant review, based on that health needs assessment, what kind of service needs to be provided. The principle of equivalence isn't that it will be the same for you and for me. The principle of equivalence is that it meets your needs as it would meet my needs, whatever those needs are. And so we will continue to work on this as we go forward. The PPO suggested that there should be a dedicated clinical governance lead solely responsible for prison healthcare. Is that person in place? I think in reality, I think to reduce such an important agenda to the responsibility of one person is misleading. Clinical governance is so vast, it involves so many different facets that it's more about the careful coordination of all of that. So as I speak to you now, I suppose I could say I am the de facto accounting officer for clinical governance in Manx Care, and so I might assume that responsibility. In reality, I depend on a whole team of people working on that agenda for us, including the boys and girls who work in the prison itself, as well as the care group leadership, the triumvirate that oversee the quality and safety of care, and the arrangements we have for escalating concerns, discussing them, agreeing adaptations to how we work. It's rarely helpful to have it the responsibility of just one person. We work as a team and we deliver the kind of change that's needed through clinical governance by working well as a team, I'd say.
Special measures for the prison healthcare team concluded in May this year. The coroner of inquests has now made 12 suggestions as part of the coronial process following the conclusion of the inquests into the deaths of Mr Anderson and Mr Corkill. They include improved access to mental health professionals, medication reviews, peer support and regular inspections by His Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons. The Department of Home Affairs and Manx Care have 56 days from receipt of his report to set out what, if any, action either body intends to take. Now, you can find links to all of the reports mentioned in this programme, as well as the details of the inquests at manxradio.com. There's also details of organisations which can provide help and support. And perhaps for this episode of Island Life, the last word from Manx Care's outgoing Deputy Chief Executive.
I have no hesitation in saying that the offender healthcare team, alongside the prison officers and the leadership team inside the prison, gives me enormous confidence that we are in a much better place than we were and have the ability to confront the challenges that lie ahead for us, to deal with offender healthcare need, but also offender healthcare need in the context of a rising prison population. I think we have a good team. We have a different way of working together, much more open, much more collegiate, and I think that goes an awful long way to being able to tackle some of the problems that lie ahead. It's deeply regrettable that they took their own lives, but these are sentinel events, and as you rightly point out, they lead us down a path to learn things from those events, and there have been many lessons from these cases that we've been dealing with recently, and with the insight of the inspector and the Ombudsman. It's allowed us to apply a focus on the prison that we might not have been able to do, and therefore I think has been enormously helpful at changing permanently the way we do offender healthcare here on the Isle of Man.